April 8, 1943, North Atlantic Ocean. At the height of the Battle of the Atlantic, U-boat warfare had reached its most brutal phase. German submarines hunted Allied convoys crossing from Halifax and Liverpool, lifelines carrying food, fuel, and weapons to Britain. That day, the Kriegsmarine's U-boat command transmitted new orders to all patrols. Maintain radio silence and avoid confrontation until the next coordinated Wolfpack attack. But one man would not obey. Korvettenkapitän Jürgen Oesten, commander of U-861, believed centralized command had become too slow, too bureaucratic, and out of touch with what was happening beneath the waves. His radar detector showed a convoy nearby. 20 merchant ships escorted by British destroyers. The convoy's code name was HX-231. His orders were clear: hold position until reinforcements arrived. Yet, Oesten had spent months watching opportunities slip away while waiting for approval from headquarters in occupied France. He decided this time would be different. In the pre-dawn hours, U-861 dove below the surface, running silent at periscope depth. Oesten ordered all lights off. Only the faint red glow of the attack scope cut through the dark. Through the narrow lens, he saw shapes on the horizon, silhouettes of tankers and freighters steaming east. Each represented thousands of tons of cargo and hundreds of lives. To strike meant defying the Befehlshaber der U-Boote, Karl Dönitz himself. But hesitation, Oesten thought, meant losing the war at sea. He ordered torpedoes los. 4 fired in rapid sequence. Moments later, 4 plumes of water erupted on the horizon. Explosions rolled across the surface like thunder. 2 tankers burst into flames, their oil slicks igniting a sea of fire. The convoy scattered in panic. British escorts immediately began depth charge runs. When U-861 slipped beneath the Atlantic waves after its second strike, the mood inside was a mix of triumph and dread. The crew knew they had done something no other boat dared, a double ambush without orders. The hydrophones picked up distant sonar pings, proof that the British escorts were still sweeping the area. Oesten kept the boat silent for 12 hours, batteries drained, air heavy with diesel fumes and fear. At 2100 hours, U-861 surfaced to recharge. The men opened the hatch for fresh air. It smelled of oil and smoke from the burning tankers still visible miles away. The radio operator handed Oesten a new message, this time from BDU headquarters. It demanded his position and confirmation of attack orders. He tore it up without reading the code suffix. He had already chosen his path. In Germany, Admiral Karl Dönitz was furious. Since 1940, he had commanded the U-boat fleet with strict discipline. Each submarine was part of a coordinated pack. Success relied on obedience. The Wolfpack system, perfected in earlier years, was meant to overwhelm convoys through mass attacks. But by 1943, Allied radar, escort carriers, and air patrols had shifted the balance. U-boats were dying faster than they could be built. Dönitz's staff suspected that Oesten's actions might expose his location and cost them more men. Still, the Kriegsmarine could not afford to punish a captain who was actually sinking ships. By the next morning, U-861 intercepted a weak distress call on Allied frequencies. Survivors from HX-231 were being picked up by British corvettes. Oesten realized that the convoy was reforming under cover of fog, slower now, more vulnerable. The decision came instantly. He ordered another pursuit, despite every standing order against it. At periscope depth, the image was blurry through condensation, but he could make out merchant vessels in staggered lines. This time, escorts circled tightly. Oesten calculated firing angles manually. They were running low on torpedoes, only 5 left. He fired 2 at the lead freighter. Both struck amidships, setting off secondary explosions from ammunition cargo. The ship split in half within minutes. Before the escorts reacted, he dove again. Depth charges fell within meters of the hull. Water sprayed from the seams. The control room's lights flickered out. Oesten stayed calm, issuing orders by voice alone. Trim tanks forward. Hold at 150 meters. His crew obeyed mechanically, trained to react through instinct. After 2 hours of pursuit, the sounds faded. They had escaped again. By that evening, British headquarters in Londonderry concluded that at least 7 ships had been destroyed in 48 hours. They believed 3 U-boats were operating in the area. The truth, that it was one, remained hidden. U-boat command, embarrassed by the disobedience but impressed by results, classified the incident as unconfirmed group action. It would later appear in internal reports as Erfolg unbekannt, success uncertain. Inside U-861, oxygen was running low. The men hadn't surfaced for 36 hours. Condensation dripped from the ceiling. Rations were reduced to bread and canned fish. Yet morale remained strangely high. Their captain had done what many whispered was impossible: strike at will and survive. Late on April 10th, Østen surfaced once more, intending to transmit a status update. His radio man, hesitant, asked whether to use the standard Enigma cipher. Østen refused. He feared the BDU might triangulate the signal and recall them. Instead, he sent a brief message to another U-boat commander he trusted. Convoy broken, success extensive, continuing independent patrol. The message would later be intercepted and partially decoded by Allied listening stations in Bletchley Park. Confirmation that rogue U-boats existed. Meanwhile, in Berlin, Dönitz's analysts debated what to do. Punishing Østen publicly would reveal the breakdown of discipline. Praising him would encourage others to ignore orders. They chose silence. The BDU log simply noted, "Contact lost with U-861, presumed continuing operations." In the North Atlantic, that meant total isolation. No resupply, no rendezvous, and no safe return route. The submarine's next move would be a gamble, either strike another convoy or retreat toward occupied France. But Østen's obsession had shifted. He now wanted to prove that a single submarine could outperform a wolf pack. Over the next days, U-861 shadowed another convoy, SC-129, heading toward Liverpool. Bad weather covered their approach. Heavy seas made depth control difficult. The boat was tossed violently, and several men were injured when tools and pipes came loose. Despite that, Østen refused to turn back. On April 12, 1943, he launched his final torpedo spread at a British troopship. One torpedo malfunctioned, running cold. Another missed entirely. The last 2 struck a 7,000-ton cargo ship carrying munitions. The resulting explosion was so violent, it registered on Allied sonar across 15 miles. Flames reached 50 meters high. For the 3rd time in 4 days, the Royal Navy scrambled destroyers, and again found no trace of the attacker. By then, Østen's fuel was critically low. He ordered a withdrawal toward the Bay of Biscay. His crew recorded 10 confirmed sinkings totaling over 45,000 tons, more than most U-boats managed in a full patrol. What awaited him in France, however, was not celebration. Commanders in Lorient had already prepared an inquiry for violation of direct command authority. U-boat culture prized initiative, but punished defiance. When Østen arrived, he was met not with medals, but silence. His war diary, the Kriegstagebuch, was confiscated immediately. Many of its pages would disappear from German archives after 1945. Official records simply listed his patrol as outstanding results under unclear circumstances. The truth of his actions, buried in secrecy, would not fully emerge until decades later, when Allied decrypts and captured German files were cross-referenced. Historians discovered that U-861's lone operation had destroyed an entire convoy and forced both sides to rethink submarine warfare. But Østen's defiance also exposed the cracks within the German command system. The event proved that obedience alone no longer guaranteed victory. The age of the wolf pack was over. When U-861 reached the Bay of Biscay, the crew expected orders to dock and resupply at Lorient. Instead, they were instructed to remain offshore and await further communication. It was an unusual order, one that made clear the High Command wasn't ready to welcome them home. German naval intelligence had been following Allied radio chatter, and it was now obvious that the Royal Navy was searching for a phantom U-boat believed to be responsible for the destruction of multiple convoys in the North Atlantic. Inside U-boat headquarters in Paris, Admiral Karl Dönitz reviewed reports that painted a contradictory picture. On one hand, a single commander had inflicted enormous losses, proof that individual initiative could still yield results despite the Allies' overwhelming advantage in radar, air patrols and escort carriers. On the other, if his officers began ignoring orders, the entire Atlantic strategy would collapse. Dönitz had long preached, Befehl ist Befehl, an order is an order. To him, the success of the U-boat fleet depended on absolute discipline, not heroics. By mid-April 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic was turning decisively against Germany. Allied aircraft based in Iceland and Newfoundland now closed the air gap, making it nearly impossible for U-boats to surface safely. Allied radar-equipped bombers could spot even a periscope from miles away. Every time a submarine surfaced to recharge, it risked destruction. In that context, Oesten's independent attacks looked reckless to the command staff. Nevertheless, reports from the Atlantic Patrol Zone confirmed Oesten's victories. 7 confirmed sinkings, 3 probable. Total tonnage lost, approximately 45,000 tons. In wartime Germany, such numbers were used for propaganda, but the propaganda ministry received no notice of his actions. Officially, U-861's patrol had limited success. At sea, the crew sensed their captain's growing isolation. Morale fluctuated between pride and unease. Oesten tried to keep them focused on routine, drills, equipment checks, and navigation calculations, but every man aboard understood they were no longer part of any official group. The Wolfpacks had moved north, and U-861 was on its own. Then came the order that changed everything. Return to base immediately. Do not engage further. Report to Laurent Command. It was transmitted through encrypted shortwave and carried the unmistakable signature of Dönitz himself. The crew cheered. Finally home. But Oesten hesitated. He read the message twice, folded it, and put it in his logbook. He knew the war was changing. Convoy defenses were improving every month. More aircraft, more sonar, more radar. To him, waiting for perfect conditions meant surrendering the Atlantic altogether. His last attack had proven that boldness could still work. He believed the only way to turn the tide was to restore the fear of U-boats, make the Allies think the ocean itself was still dangerous. So instead of turning toward France, he set course north, toward the shipping lanes off Ireland. His officers were stunned. He justified it by claiming that the route home passed near those waters anyway. But everyone understood what he was really doing, defying Dönitz again. For 3 days they shadowed coastal convoys under constant threat of aircraft. The men slept in turns, nerves frayed by the sound of distant propellers. On April 18th, they detected a small convoy of 5 merchant ships with minimal escort, a tempting target. Oesten ordered the periscope raised. Visibility was poor, rain hammering the sea surface, but he could make out silhouettes moving slowly east. He fired 2 torpedoes. Both struck true. Within minutes, smoke and debris littered the water, yet this time the British escorts were faster. Using new HFDF, Huff-Duff radio direction systems, they triangulated the origin of the attack within minutes. 2 corvettes and a Sunderland flying boat closed in simultaneously. Oesten ordered a crash dive. Depth charges fell immediately. The first exploded close to the conning tower, knocking out the compass repeater. The lights flickered, gauges shattered. Men were thrown from their stations. At 180 meters, they leveled off. The hull groaned like bending steel under immense pressure. The second wave of depth charges detonated closer, forcing seawater through the seams. The chief engineer shouted that the aft ballast tank was leaking. Oesten ordered pumps on full and trimmed the boat manually. For 4 hours they were hunted. Then, silence. The enemy had moved on, convinced the submarine was destroyed. When they surfaced that night, the horizon was clear. The radio operator tried to send a position report, but found the antenna damaged. They were effectively invisible to both enemy and command. U-861 drifted through fog, running on fumes, its hull scarred and engines weakened. 2 days later, a German reconnaissance aircraft spotted the submarine and transmitted its coordinates to Laurent. Dönitz's message followed. Proceed to port. Immediate inquiry. Oesten said nothing. The men cheered weakly. They wanted land, food, rest. But they knew the welcome would not be friendly. When U-861 finally entered Laurent on April 22nd, the submarine pens were nearly full of damaged boats. More than a dozen had failed to return that month alone. Eston's vessel, though battered, had survived the deadliest month of the Atlantic campaign. He stood on deck as naval officers approached. There were no photographers, no press, only silence. Within hours, his crew was separated for debriefing. Interrogators from BDU headquarters questioned each man about orders received, engagements logged, and transmissions sent. The same question was asked repeatedly. Did your captain deliberately ignore command instructions? Most avoided answering. A few admitted that yes, he had. Eston himself was summoned before a closed tribunal the next morning. He was accused of insubordination during active patrol, failure to maintain communication protocol, and unauthorized engagement of enemy forces. He listened calmly, never denying his actions. When asked why he disobeyed, his response was simple. Because waiting for permission has cost us the Atlantic. The room fell silent. The tribunal recorded his statement but postponed sentencing. Dönitz, aware that punishing him would demoralize other crews, issued an unusual order. Eston would be reassigned to instructional duties at a training base in Norway, far from the front lines. It was neither an honor nor a disgrace, it was quiet exile. The crew of U-861 dispersed among other boats. The submarine itself was repaired and reassigned under a new commander. Its patrol log was rewritten to fit official doctrine. But among U-boat sailors, the legend of the captain who ignored orders spread quickly. Some called him a fool, others a hero. Years later, Allied intelligence would confirm that his rogue patrol had indeed destroyed an entire convoy, an outcome that temporarily disrupted supply lines and forced the Royal Navy to alter convoy routes for weeks. Yet within Germany, the incident was never mentioned publicly. For a regime built on discipline, acknowledging success born from disobedience was impossible. Eston disappeared from the front, but his impact lingered. The U-boat war was collapsing and commanders quietly debated whether his independent tactics might have saved them had they been adopted earlier. The debate came too late. Within a year, the Atlantic was lost. By mid-1944, Jürgen Osten was stationed at a U-boat training facility in Bergen, Norway, far from the Atlantic battlefront where he had built his reputation. The war had shifted decisively. Allied control of the skies, advanced sonar, and escort carriers made the Atlantic nearly impossible to penetrate. Submarines that once hunted freely now operated in constant fear. Nearly 75% of Germany's U-boat crews would not survive the war. At Bergen, Osten was assigned to instruct new recruits, young men barely out of school, many of whom had never seen combat. His lectures emphasized navigation, discipline, and survival. But behind closed doors, his philosophy was very different. He believed the rigid doctrine enforced by the Kriegsmarine had doomed them. When asked about the Wolfpack strategy, he called it obsolete. He told his trainees, "If you wait for permission, the enemy will find you first." His superiors were uneasy. Though never formally punished, he was closely monitored. Dönitz's staff feared his attitude could spread to younger officers, but morale was collapsing anyway. U-boat losses were catastrophic, and the propaganda of the invincible sea hunters no longer matched reality. Recruits who arrived in Bergen understood that their odds of returning from patrols were minimal. Eston's warnings didn't discourage them. They confirmed what most already suspected. By late 1944, Germany's industrial capacity was breaking down. Fuel shortages limited submarine patrols. The Allies bombed shipyards relentlessly. In January 1945, orders came to deploy every remaining vessel, even training submarines, to defend the Norwegian coast and intercept Allied convoys heading to Murmansk. Osten requested to return to combat command. His request was denied. He was considered unreliable, prone to independent action. Still, reports circulated among officers that he was secretly advising certain commanders to ignore centralized orders if conditions demanded. His methods, stealth, silence, and unpredictable attacks had once terrified Allied convoys. Some captains quietly listened, others reported him. The Reich's command culture tolerated no deviation, especially now as defeat loomed. By March 1945, U-boat command had relocated much of its operation to Norway. The Allies were closing in from both east and west. Germany's last submarines left port on what were essentially suicide missions. Among them was U-2511, commanded by Ernst Kals, a captain who had trained under Oesten months earlier. Before departure, Kals visited Oesten in Bergen. According to later testimony, Oesten told him, "Forget orders, trust the sea and your instincts. It will decide who survives." On May 2, 1945, Germany formally began surrender negotiations. 2 days later, Dönitz, now Führer after Hitler's death, issued the ceasefire order to all remaining U-boats. But in the chaos of collapsing communication networks, not every submarine received it immediately. That same day, a strange incident occurred near the North Atlantic. A convoy of Allied ships en route to Halifax reported being shadowed by an unidentified U-boat. Radar picked up faint contacts, then lost them. Hours later, 2 explosions were detected, followed by distress signals from a damaged freighter. The convoy commander noted in his log that the attacker appeared to break off voluntarily. The date was May 4, 1945, 2 days before Germany's surrender. Post-war analysis would later show that no U-boats were officially on patrol in that sector. Yet records from Bergen indicate one vessel, a small type 9C, had left port without authorization days earlier. Its commanding officer was never identified. Some historians believe that Oesten himself may have led a final unauthorized patrol. Others dismiss it as rumor. No conclusive proof was ever found. After the surrender, Allied investigators interrogated every surviving U-boat officer. Oesten was taken into custody in Norway by British naval intelligence. They questioned him about his 1943 patrol, the one that had destroyed an entire convoy. The British wanted to understand how one commander had achieved such success when so many others had failed. His answer was short. "I ignored orders that no longer made sense." The interrogators, aware of his reputation, noted that he spoke calmly, without boasting or regret. They concluded that he had acted independently out of tactical reasoning, not ideology. British intelligence classified his behavior as non-political and purely operational. As a result, he was not prosecuted. By late 1946, he was released and allowed to return to civilian life in Germany. After the war, Oesten rarely spoke publicly. He settled in Hamburg and worked as a merchant marine consultant. The Kriegsmarine archives never reinstated his 1943 patrol into official combat statistics. It remained redacted, recorded only as an irregular action. Still, among surviving submariners, his legend persisted. The man who had sunk more ships in one patrol than entire flotillas, yet vanished from history because he disobeyed orders. In the early 1950s, researchers from the Royal Navy's historical branch began declassifying wartime convoy logs. One of those logs, Convoy HX-231, detailed how a single submarine had crippled 5 ships over 48 hours. The British analysts cross-referenced radio intercepts with decrypted Enigma messages. They found one German call sign matching U-861. The entry was simple. Attacks continue despite command order to stand down. That discovery reignited debate among naval historians. Some argued that Oesten's independence proved the value of decentralized command, that submarines needed autonomy to adapt to rapidly changing battle conditions. Others warned that it was dangerous romanticism. The German Navy's downfall, they said, stemmed precisely from captains acting on pride rather than coordination. In 1959, Oesten was quietly interviewed for a post-war documentary about the U-boat service. He appeared for less than a minute, sitting beside a chart of the Atlantic. The interviewer asked, "Do you regret what you did?" He paused, then replied, "Regret doesn't change the past. We followed logic, not politics. The ocean only respects those who act." It was the last public statement he ever gave. He lived until 2010, passing away at age 97. Few outside naval circles knew his name. Most of his wartime logbooks remain sealed in German military archives. But his reputation among historians evolved. He came to represent the breaking point of the U-boat war, when the line between duty and survival blurred, and one man's defiance revealed both the strength and fragility of the system he served. In the years that followed, modern naval academies studied the Battle of the Atlantic as a case study in command failure. Eston's 1943 patrol was often cited in internal reports, not for its glory, but for the question it raised. What happens when obedience becomes more dangerous than the enemy? By the end of the war, the legend of Jürgen Osten had taken on two lives, one inside the German Navy's whispered history and another in the classified archives of Allied intelligence. For Germany, he represented the dangers of disobedience. For the Allies, he was proof that even the most disciplined enemy could fracture under pressure. Yet neither side fully understood what drove him. The man who defied orders, fought alone, and sank an entire convoy through instinct and timing rather than command. After 1945, the Royal Navy's Operational Intelligence Centre, OIC, compiled a comprehensive list of all recorded convoy losses. Among them, the case of convoy HX-231 stood out. Officially, it was attributed to multiple U-boats operating independently. But British cryptographers knew that wasn't true. Signals intercepted from Enigma networks had pinpointed one submarine, U-861, as the sole attacker. The report concluded, unclear motives, command communications ignored, targeting efficient, behavior atypical of standard U-boat doctrine. In 1950, declassified intercepts revealed that the Germans themselves had struggled to explain the incident. A captured Kriegsmarine document, dated June 1943, described U-861's actions as outside the boundaries of coordinated strategy, but admitted notable tonnage success. It was signed by an adjutant in Dönitz's office. The phrase independent initiative was underlined twice. For historians, the meaning was clear. The Battle of the Atlantic, once governed by strict central command, had by 1943 become so desperate that individual captains were acting on instinct. Some scholars argued that this independence marked the beginning of modern submarine warfare, a shift from obedience to flexibility. In later decades, NATO submariners studying the conflict used Osten's patrol as an example of autonomous engagement under compromised command systems. But for Osten, the reality was far less heroic. In post-war Germany, most former officers avoided speaking of defiance. The country was rebuilding, and the old debates over loyalty versus logic no longer had a place. When he was occasionally asked about the HX-231 attack, he deflected. It was a bad time, he said. We all did what we thought might shorten it. By the 1960s, declassified British records revealed the human cost of that single patrol. Convoy HX-231 had consisted of 22 ships. 10 were destroyed or fatally damaged. Over 600 sailors and merchant mariners lost their lives. Survivors testified that the attacks were relentless and precise, occurring over 2 days without pause. One captain recalled, "It was like being stalked by a ghost. No coordination, no pattern, just destruction." Naval historians later calculated that Osten's patrol inflicted the single most concentrated loss inflicted by one U-boat in 1943. The feat stood out even amid a war that had seen hundreds of similar engagements. But what made it extraordinary was not the number of ships sunk, but the fact that it had been carried out against explicit orders from the highest authority in the German Navy. As archives opened in the 1970s and 1980s, researchers reconstructed his patrol route using decrypted Enigma traffic, surviving ship logs, and sonar reports. The picture that emerged was consistent. Osten had identified a weakness in convoy formation, a timing gap between escorts shifting from night to day rotations. Rather than wait for the Wolfpack order, he struck during the changeover, hitting the most exposed rear and midline ships first. It was tactical brilliance, but it directly contradicted the strict engagement protocol issued by Dönitz's headquarters. By acting alone, Osten had proven two things: that the central command system was no longer suited to modern warfare, and that a commander's survival instinct could sometimes achieve what bureaucracy could not. Ironically, the very independence that had made him effective also ensured that his legacy would remain buried. The post-war German Navy, the Bundesmarine, deliberately avoided glorifying officers who had disobeyed wartime orders, even if those actions had military merit. In 1993, a naval historian named Rolf Schreiber published a detailed analysis of the U-861 patrol. His conclusion was blunt. Had the Kriegsmarine embraced tactical autonomy earlier, the Battle of the Atlantic might have lasted longer. But authoritarian command structures destroyed initiative at every level. The statement sparked controversy in Germany. Some veterans supported him, others condemned the idea as revisionist. Payson himself refused interviews. When contacted by Schreiber in 1995, he declined to comment, replying only with a brief letter, "History will decide who was wrong." He lived quietly until his death in 2010. When he passed away, naval historians in Germany and Britain revisited his case one last time. The Bundesarchiv declassified additional U-boat patrol records that confirmed the missing pages from U-861's Kriegstagebuch, his war diary, had been deliberately removed after the war. Marginal notes from 1943 reveal internal debate among Dönitz's officers over whether to prosecute or commend him. One handwritten annotation read simply, "Erfolg zu groß zum Bestrafen." The success is too great to punish. The modern German Navy eventually added Oesten's name to its list of wartime commanders, though his 1943 patrol remains footnoted as independent action outside official orders. Naval historians still cite it as a case study in the psychology of command, how pressure, isolation, and tactical instinct can override even the strictest hierarchy. Today, his story survives not in military honors, but in footnotes and after-action reports, a cautionary tale about leadership in crisis. The man who ignored orders to strike a convoy alone proved that courage and defiance can coexist, but that both carry a cost. His patrol stands as one of the most extraordinary examples of initiative in naval history and a reminder that the line between heroism and insubordination often depends on who wins the war.